When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
What's worse than an ad interrupting your favorite music or podcast? That uninspired coffee you've been drinking while working, which is why Flavia is elevating your everyday coffee experience. Now you can enjoy cafe-quality beverages like coffee, tea, frothy lattes, and creamy hot chocolate made right in your home office, actual office, or wherever you want to upgrade your mug with bold, delicious flavors. Visit Flavia.com to shop the collection of machines and beverages now.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Hello, mega orderers. We are back with another emergency cast. It is the Iran-Israel war. We're recording on Monday, the 16th of June. The war is 4 days old. Jane and I have not really gotten a weekend because we worked the wars, as they say. I was playing the role of presenter's friend on Sky News from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Sunday morning, enjoying Trump's insane anti-American military parade while seeing the split screen of Iranian missiles falling in Haifa, Tel Aviv, buildings being blown up. And then they didn't even show the horrific images of the fuel depot in the suburbs of Tehran, on fire, like 10,000 barrels of crude and refined product. Refined product, it's the most flammable thing on the planet. This refined petrol is just causing some environmental disaster there. And the southern Pars field, this is the world's largest and most important gas field shared between Qatar and the Iranians. We're talking south of Kharg Island here, that all these things were hit. This is the war of global enduring disorder, Jane, and it's playing out on our screens with the backdrop of Trump's military parade and jingoistic salutes and insane speech. Howsoever can we help the orderers understand all of this?
Well, today I think we can talk through trying to make some sense of what is happening between Israel and Iran, why it's happening, and how this might draw to an end, what role there is for the international community. But hopefully, I've always wanted to look at the Middle East not as this kind of great game chessboard, but as a place where people live, people like you and me, who would most of the time really prefer to be able to get on with their lives. Even here in London, I'm acutely aware just dropping my kids at school or going to work, that there are many people around me who have got family and friends somewhere in this growing zone of wars, be that in Israel, in Iran, or in Gaza, and of course beyond the Middle East, everywhere else, Russia, Ukraine, Sudan, So I'm aware many people listening to this may be anxiously checking the news because they literally want to know if their family members are okay. And I'd like to keep a bit of that perspective as we talk about the geopolitics of all of this. My sympathies are also with you, Jason, in that you had to watch the full military parade at the same time as monitoring all of this. And I think you are a man of enormous stamina and bravery. I must say that I was asleep throughout that period, and I feel a little bit better for that.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you didn't miss much. It was an American history lesson, but with a very bizarre aesthetic. The militarism of the American army is the best. We won all the wars. We won this. We won the war on terror. This unit did this. Now we're at the future section, and there's like a walking metal dog that's going to be used to plant landmines. And you're like, why would you parade this thing? Who wants to brag about having this ability to plant landmines with a drone? I think it showed weakness. And then it's just dead catting. He was really dead catting from the fact that America is essentially in a state of civil war. The wars of disorder have now finally come home. In LA, there's tear gas against the ICE protests. And tragically, in Minnesota over the weekend, a state senator and her husband were killed in their homes by a psychopath who impersonated a police officer to get access to the home and then just killed them in their own beds. This is insane. All these conflict spheres are interacting with each other. And I want to lead by telling the mega orderers what Netanyahu has started, only Trump or the international community can end. That's what I firmly believe. Neither the Iranians nor Netanyahu can end this conflict. It requires an international off-ramp, whether it's militarily, the giving of the bunker buster bombs to hit Fardao, or negotiating some kind of solution. And I don't see an international community that is ready to, either in war or in peace, really play a constructive role. And yet, the leaders of the most powerful democracies are at the G7 conference. So, Jane, firstly, let's back up. Jane, what happened over the weekend?
So what we've seen over the weekend is this war escalating, but not so far widening. That could even change between recording and people listening to this. But, we've seen Israel striking Iran. We've seen Iran getting together some ability to strike back. We've seen Israel, as you say, hitting the oil depot and the gas field. We've seen Iran attacking energy infrastructure in Israel. Overnight, Iran got further strikes through. I think there had been expectations that it maybe wouldn't be able to do as much damage because Israel had taken out so much of the Iranian air defences. But there have been now deaths on both sides, including Palestinian citizens of Israel as well as Jewish Israelis, in a kind of irony, given the fact that Iran prides itself, or the regime prides itself so much on helping the Palestinian cause. The news that the first casualties were Palestinian citizens of Israel.
And I want to just jump in here to explain that further. The Iranians just lob missiles. They're not necessarily going for specific targets. They had in the October 2024 retaliation on the attack at their embassy in Damascus, gone after some Israeli military targets, but they also just shot a barrage of missiles. And then it tends to be that in Israel, the only people who don't go to safe rooms or who don't own bomb shelters or who don't listen to the air raids are Bedouin Arab Israelis and some Palestinian citizens of Israel. So a Bedouin boy was killed in the October 2024 Iranian missile strike. Now the Iranians are more targeting civilian and densely populated urban areas, Haifa, Tel Aviv in specific, and then some suburbs of those. I think it is interesting that there is reporting that some aspects of Iron Dome plus David Sling and the arrows are able to be overcome by throwing a certain number of missiles all in one go in a location. So that there's like, this hour is Haifa, and then they go all there, and then this hour is Bnei Brak, where the Orthodox live outside Tel Aviv, and then whatever. So we're seeing kind of sequential mass targeting in one location.
Yep, and this is what the Iranians are describing as their new method, try to swarm things. And we'll see how also Israel responds to that. I think another thing that's worth noting is that I think Netanyahu has tried to keep Israel's communications very focused on Iran's regime being the target and not Iranian civilians. There was also a tweet by the Israeli defense minister that said, Iran is attacking our civilians and the people of Tehran will pay the price. That was quickly clarified. Sounds like he was asked to make it clear that he was not issuing an Israeli threat against Iranian civilians.
Also, that would be stooping to the level of just literally causing terror and pain to cause terror and pain with no strategic goal.
I think someone gave him a call to point that out to him.
I wouldn't put it past Netanyahu because he's done some bad stuff in his career, but that would be a huge, huge, huge mistake, because if there's any moral high ground, it's we're attacking nuclear scientists and nuclear sites and strategic pieces of infrastructure of the regime. If they were then just retaliating against the population in Tehran, that would be an absolute catastrophe.
What remains really unclear to me, and what I would be desperate to find out if I was at the G7, is what does Trump actually want here? Because, it seems quite ironic in some ways, as you describe, watching this big military parade while the war is going off in the Middle East. It's very unclear to me whether he wants to be this president of peace or whether he wants to put more of the emphasis on strength in this peace through strength thing. And I think that his communications over the last few days have been hugely confusing. The last statement that I have seen has been about him saying, look, I have brought peace to Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, so stop criticizing me. But really, so much, as you said at the outset, it is going to hinge on what America does. Does America go into the war fully? Does it try to broker some kind of ceasefire with a nuclear climb-down component to it? Do the other world leaders actually know what Trump wants at this point? Because I think in the recent talks between the US and Iran, those were completely bilateral. Other countries had an interest in them. Other countries were lobbying the US about certain things. But ultimately, it was a US-Iran thing. Maybe if there had been something multilateral, it would be easier to put them back together now. I don't know.
I think it's a very important point, Jane. I'm a fan of the JCPOA. It was a great achievement for Obama, and what it achieved had to do with its multilaterality. It didn't just involve the P5+3. It was that Russia and China participated and the West got on board. It was a complex, multi-pronged approach to create an international community solution. I am not a technical expert as to whether sanctions relief should have been less or the ability to allow the Iranians to enrich at a civilian level should have been more or less. But what I loved about that deal was that it roped in NATO countries, P5, Russia, China, and it had regional consensus, particularly in the Gulf, less so in Israel, but in the Middle Eastern region in terms of how to deal with Iran. Trump doesn't like multilateral stuff at all, and he doesn't like being at the G7 now. He'd just prefer to, one-on-one have Ramaphosa or Zelensky at the Oval Office where he can make fun of them and make them squirm and humiliate them on his terms. And therefore, it seemed that what he liked about bilateral negotiations with Iran is he would make a similar deal to the JCPOA, but as a bilateral Iranian-U.S. deal. And the U.S., in any bilateral relationship, is always going to be the most powerful because of its economy and its institutions, right? So I would argue that he misunderstands the nature of nuclear diplomacy, which is inherently a collective action problem. Collective action problems are multilateral by their nature. Hence, bilateral approaches aren't going to succeed. And the diplomacy for the off-ramp from this war is going to have to be multilateral, but Trump is going to want it to be unilateral or bilateral. So that's part of why he has all these mixed messages. And I think that he's going to be very, very uncomfortable at the G7 summit because he's going to feel that they, meaning Carney, Starmer, Macron, the Japanese, and Merz in Germany are quote-unquote ganging up against him. And all he has is Maloney to work with there. Do you know what I mean? It's Trump with his little mini ally Maloney against everyone else who's against him at the G7. And I think Maloney may even defect from him on some views of the Iran and Israel stuff. So you're right. He is deeply inconsistent in terms of what he wants. And this shows to me why neopopulists are disorderers. They're disorderers because they don't have specific strategic policy aims. He doesn't have an aim about whether he wants bunker buster bombs hitting Fardao or not, whether he wanted the war to start or not start, how he envisions relations with Israel within the region. I think he just wants to do what he thinks that 52% of the American population will like him for and whatever will get him plaudits or more TV coverage. Like the whole parade and all of the statements are just calculated based on getting TV coverage and poll numbers, and they're not about any strategic endgame.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And his base seems to be divided on a lot of these issues. You know, compared with the first Trump term, I've been quite interested to observe the emergence of this mostly younger generation anti-war America first right, because that seems to me to be a new element and one that's quite interesting. But it seems like all of a sudden those guys are very, very much on the back foot. And then we still actually have the Iraq war supporting neocons coming out. I mean, I just saw one of them, Michael Doran, who's been a big supporter of regime change in Iran. He's collecting what he sees as bad takes on this war because he thinks basically you should just support regime change. I remember him coming and speaking at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where I did my master's in 2002 to 2003. And he came and he spoke to us students about why the invasion of Iraq would be such a good thing and how it would end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because, as he said, the road to Jerusalem goes through Baghdad. Once you take out Saddam, basically the drive for Palestinian terrorism will stop and everything will be great. So these guys, these guys are still around and they're still having a voice in policy. It's really quite amazing. I mean, perhaps...
I think it's easy to make fun of neocons, but not so much Michael Doran. I mean, he was a genuine regional expert. He taught at Princeton, and he was turfed out of Princeton because essentially you can't be a right-wing neocon in the Ivy League anymore. I find it easier to make fun of a guy like Bolton, who doesn't really have the regional expertise. Doran, we might ideologically disagree with him, and I do. Do you know what I mean? I don't agree with that neocon approach, but he's someone whose Arabic was probably very, very strong, and he read Ottoman source material and spent a lot of time in the region. I understand that this is the revenge of the neocons, and Bolton is writing a Wall Street Journal piece saying, yes, this is the regime change moment. It would have been better if we did it sooner. You and I think that it would have been better if we never left the JCPOA. They think it would have been better if we did regime change in Iran sooner. But the problem is that we've gotten here by flip-flopping back and forth. Oh, a little negotiation. Oh, then we'll pull out of these negotiations. Oh, a bit of an attack. Then we won't complete the attack. There is a case that either extreme is correct and that we are seeing policies being pushed more towards extremes.
I don't know. I feel that the flip-flopping is coming thick and fast. And I've been struck around Trump's election by how much the shadow of the Iraq War seemed to still weigh on the American political debates. But I'm unclear what really has been learned from it. And I wonder if, in the minds of some, the view is basically regime change could still be good if we could avoid being very involved in it directly ourselves, which also seems to me potentially quite unrealistic.
I think it's extremely unrealistic because, one, Israel is not popular in Iran, even among the anti-Ayatollah wing, the kind of Mahsen Amini protesting style people, young women or people who support the Shah. So we need to get to the fact that if there is going to be movement against the regime, it's not going to come from elite Shah-supporting elements who are happy to have the support of Israel. It requires a broader Western approach, but the allies have been very clear, the US, UK, France, and others, to stay out and to be at arm's length. There are reports that the US is helping defensively in the shooting down of some Iranian missiles, but probably less so than they did last time because they're trying to not position assets in a way that seems to be involved. And that the British have allowed El Al planes to relocate to Cyprus, to Limassol, the British base there, and that some RAF assets have deployed to Limassol to use their deterrent capacity against Hezbollah or other Iranian proxy attacks, but that they're not actually doing anything. They're only there to deter. So it's a complicated picture where the hands-off nature of British, American, and French, even defensive support for Israel, makes it quite unlikely that there is a signal for help or support in any regime change operation. In other words, Bolton and Michael Doran have not gotten what they wanted.
I think the regime change has not had much support, for some years, even in the US, because people in government analytical positions haven't really seen a pathway to having a stable opposition government. So I think there's a moral support for Iranians to be able to enjoy civil and political and human rights, but there hasn't been a kind of theory of change, by which I mean an understanding of how that would potentially come to be. And I think there have also been worries about whether Iran as a state could even break down into sort of ethnic and regional conflicts. And I think Western governments don't like to talk about this very much because they don't want to seem to criticize or undermine the Iranian opposition. But I think when you get into the analysis, those kind of worries are there.
100%. These are things that one needs to worry about. So it makes sense that American and European policymakers are not so keen to just weigh in on regime change in a chaotic way, because what we saw with the Arab Spring, when you have leaderless protest movements and they win, what do you know? The people who take over are not popularly supported and they have no coherent economic or ideological vision for the country. And you have the range of Libya scenario on the one hand, or the Egyptian scenario where a worse version of the old regime comes back because there was no one else to actually provide any kind of coherent governance. I'm not optimistic for the future of Iran. I would like to see this war concluded. It, I fear, has to be successful to Israeli terms, or it won't be concluded. And I hope that the Israelis only understand success as meaning taking out the uranium enrichment capacities in Natanz, Faradu, and Esfahan, and that they don't have broader ambitions about destroying the infrastructure or regime change, because those are very, very negative ambitions. They're not going to happen, and then they will cripple Iran for generations and not allow the Iranian people to use that infrastructure, which they're really going to need to pursue their post-Ayatollah lives. So there is a logic for America merely giving the bunker-busting bombs to the Israelis so that it can then be done and there can be some kind of off-ramp.
I think this argument is going to be being heard behind the scenes at the G7 and more widely is now this has started, there needs to be help to finish the job because leaving it half done is the worst outcome. But it also seems to me very problematic for the US to step in directly in that way, especially given that it is less than a week since we were expecting there to be continued diplomacy between the US and Iran over the nuclear program, and the US, UK, France, and others joined this International Atomic Energy Agency resolution that censured Iran for not cooperating with the agency, but also called for diplomacy to resolve the issues. So I am worried about the damage that gets done to the peaceful non-proliferation route, and also about the war widening. So for me, if it is still possible to keep the US out of the fighting and to have them involved in negotiating some kind of outcome, that would be good. I don't expect that to happen in the next few days, but I think that would need to be part of the way out.
After the break, Jane and I will talk about other ways out as we order the disorder.
Shopping is hard.
I can never find anything in my size.
I don't even know my size.
I buy my clothes the same place I buy my groceries.
There's a better way. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Just share your size, style, budget, and done. Your personal stylist sends pieces picked just for you.
That was easy.
Stitch Fix. Online personal styling for everyone. Free shipping and returns. No subscription required. Get started today at stitchfix.com.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
This episode is brought to you by Hulu, presenting Paradise. Paradise is Hulu's critically acclaimed addictive drama series, starring Sterling K. Brown, Julianne Nicholson, and James Marsden. The Daily Beast calls Paradise your next TV obsession, and the New York Times says it's exhilarating in all the right ways. Paradise is for your Emmy consideration in all categories, including Outstanding Drama Series. For more information, visit fyc.hulu.com.
Hello, Mega Orderers. I am back with Jane Kinninmont, our favorite Glaswegian co-host, bringing some positive Celtic energy to what is otherwise a pretty depressing and tiring situation in the Middle East. Jane, I don't see how this gets done militarily without the U.S., and I don't see how this gets done diplomatically without the U.S. What's going on at the G7, and then could there be others who could mediate? I know that you have been studying the potential role of players like India, who have equities with both Iran and Israel. Maybe start with telling us a little bit about how other countries could be involved in mediating, and then let's get to what's going on with the core Western countries at the G7.
So as we think about what might be ways out of this situation, I think it's quite important that there are so many rising powers around the world and non-Western powers who really want there to be stability in the Middle East, especially in the Persian Gulf waterway and in the wealthy Gulf states, because so many countries have got an interest in that oil and have got an interest in the rich countries being able to function.
I want to point out here, which is that China takes about 2 million barrels a day of Iranian crude. It's by far the majority of Iranian crude is being sent to China. And if it was off the market, it would hurt the Chinese the most.
China has big equities in Iran being successful, but they also have important and growing relationships with the Arab states of the Gulf region. And generally, they want that part of the world to be stable so that ships can keep coming out and trade can flow. So far, they haven't done much to actually mediate. There has been a Shanghai Cooperation Council statement that condemned Israel for attacking. Interestingly, India dissented from that statement. It wants to be neutral here, and by neutral in this case, it means not criticizing either side, but just calling for de-escalation. It has good ties with Israel, it has good ties with Iran, it has a large number of workers, of course, in the Gulf states, so it stands to lose a lot if the conflict was to widen there too.
That's really well put, Jane. India has unique equities with all three of those sides that no one else has. Modi has his personal relationship with Netanyahu, but it has this great tradition going back to Nehru of non-alignment. So could the Indians have a summit? Could they be mediators? Could they make some phone calls? What are your thoughts?
I think this could potentially be quite a valuable route. I don't think they would leap into doing this if they thought that it would upset the US. So I think at this point it would be good to see if the G7 could seek to involve wider actors. I mean, we know also that Putin has offered to mediate. I find that really interesting because actually he does have those top level relationships. And if you actually go back a couple of years, there was a point where Netanyahu said he would be a good person, Bibi, to mediate between Russia and Ukraine because he knew both sides. And while that never materialized, it does speak to important personal relationships. However, I cannot imagine that the broader G7 want to rely on Russia for a way out of this. And it could be really interesting to task India with hosting something. Funnily enough, the Iranian foreign minister was one of the people trying to mediate between India and Pakistan in their recent standoff, which the US eventually managed to de-escalate. So we can see non-traditional mediators may grow in importance at a time when, sadly, the UN does not seem to have the ability or the will to get involved whenever a conflict closely involves one of the P5 countries.
It's not only that the UN doesn't have the will, the international community is so defunct that these important bilateral relationships, and particularly leaders who've been in place for a long time, become important. Netanyahu and Putin have really pretty much run their countries for 20 years and have core equities with every major state on earth, right? Even their enemies they know well. And Modi, it's only been 10 years, so he's like newer to the club.
He's a spring chicken.
India is a state, due to its tech industry, its diaspora, its Commonwealth ties, they have core equities with pretty much every country on the planet. And these big picture leaders are more important now in the global enduring disorder than ever. And I think that this gets at something that we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is that politics went from being about interests to being about Shakespeare. And it's about these personalities and these individuals. Sticking with India, I do think that Modi is the one who has the most core equities and is yet the most neutral, because Putin has a lot of core equities but isn't as neutral. What would the Indians like to see out of a mediation or a solution or an off-ramp? What motivate them?
India could be suffering greatly if the war expands. Most obviously, there would be the disruption to the many Indian workers in the Persian Gulf area. I think there will also be complex interplays with the Pakistan side of things as well, that, very broadly here, Pakistan would side with Iran over Israel, although they've had their own problems too, Pakistan and Iran. Iran fired missiles into Pakistan not so long ago to retaliate against terrorists coming from Pakistani territory. But the sort of destabilization that we see from a Middle East war could bleed over into South Asia in complex and unpleasant ways. At the end of the day, India could choose to stay out of all of this. But the fact that it is neutral. It doesn't have a history with either side that has caused huge amounts of baggage and resentment. It's not seeking to insert itself as a dominator in the region. These things make it well placed, and Modi could benefit in some ways by doing something that would be welcomed by the rest of the international community and sort of show himself as a statesman on that global stage. But as I say, I think it would be only if it appeared that the US would welcome that, because if it was something that was going to cause him problems with Donald Trump, I don't think India's interests in the Middle East are central enough to be worth really pissing off the Americans.
Very interesting and well explained there. I'm going to do the good cop, bad cop thing here, the little Witkoff Netanyahu routine, and talk about ways in which key players can help the war come to an end militarily, right? I'd like to see a diplomatic solution, and I do think India is the best poised to be a truly neutral mediator, but I don't see that happening. I think this war continues for another couple of weeks or more until there is a decisive Israeli victory. That's the way I see it. And decisive Israeli victory is only determined by the destroying of all the centrifuges in both Natanz and Fardau, and truly setting back the Iranian nuclear program, not by like just 2 or 3 years, as we spoke about, if they incomplete the job, but setting it back by 10 or more years. I think that there may be things that is not covered in the popular press about how the Israelis plan to do that. But the press makes it seem like they require these 14,000 kilogram bunker busting American bombs, which can only be on B-2 bombers. The Israelis both don't have the bomb, and they don't have bombers which can carry such a heavy bomb. Whether the Americans would give them and the Israelis would operate them, whether Americans need to actually fire these bombs, it is scary, because that sounds like a World War III scenario once a Russian ally, Iran, is attacked directly by American jets and American bombs rather than Israelis doing it. I just don't know. I also can see a scenario, and I know this may sound weird, I can see a scenario where the Israelis lose this war. That seems really difficult to explain to people, because it's like, wait a second, the Israelis surprised them, they killed their leadership, they got them, no one saw it coming, and they now have aerial supremacy over Iran to a greater degree than was ever seen possible. In other words, they have more aerial supremacy over Iran than the Russians do over Ukraine, and Ukraine has no air force. But I could see the Israelis losing this war. Why? It has to do with asymmetrical pain thresholds. Look at the tariff issue between China and the US. The Chinese export much more goods than the US. The Chinese are also more export dependent in terms of percentage of GDP and what they need for employment. Like, only 15% of the American workforce is in any way involved in exports. And in China, it's like 50 or 60%. And yet the Chinese can withstand the pain of the tariffs tanking their economy, people losing their jobs. It's a dictatorship. And Xi said, we're doing this in a patriotic way. You've just got to suck it up, and we're going to deny the magnets and the rare earths that go into these magnets to the U.S. And he brought the U.S. to the table. He took greater pain. And it seems to me that the Chinese have won the first or second round, depending on how you count, of the tariff war, despite the fact that they have the quote-unquote weaker hand, to use Trump's terms. Israel has a much stronger hand in this war, right? They have aerial supremacy. They had intelligence dominance. Their population supports them, whereas the majority of the Iranian population doesn't support the Ayatollahs. But the difference is that Israelis don't have a high pain threshold, and Iranians do. Every night, Israelis in the whole country now have to sleep in their bomb shelters. They have friends who've been killed or who are at hospital from having their buildings blown up. People wake up and their cars and their places of work have been destroyed. They go out onto the street and they see rubble, and their car has been blown up, even if they are safe because they're sleeping in the bomb shelter. I do wonder how much longer can this go on, right? I don't know if the Iranians have ballistic missile stockpiles that the Israelis either can't hit or didn't know that they have. If this goes on for 2-3 weeks, the Israeli economy and population is like, wait a second, we can't even commute because the road that gets me to my job is blown up and my car is blown up and there are no Uber drivers because, the country is not functioning. You may say it's a first world problem. They're alive. What if they can't get an Uber or their car has been blown up? And I'm going to say Israelis expect a first world lifestyle and a Western European level of living standard. You have to keep in mind that the per capita GNP in Israel for a Jewish Israeli is greater than in Britain for a Christian. How much pain can a Brit withstand before saying to his government, we don't want that every night we have to sleep in the bomb shelter and the roads in our cars are blown up? Yes, Israelis have been trained to think that they need to support the government and that they need to have a reasonably high pain threshold. But I would argue people with a Western standard of living don't have the pain threshold of people with a Iranian or African or Chinese standard of living. And I just wonder if there is a scenario in which the Israelis back down because the population already hates Netanyahu. And they may want to get rid of the Iranian nuclear capacity. That's very popular. Even Arab Israelis would mostly support that. Even left-wing Israelis support that. But do they want to see the civilian population having cars and roads and buildings and skyscrapers in Tel Aviv decimated by this very unpopular PM, Netanyahu, who has corruption cases against him and who has butchered so many kids in Gaza, which is not very popular? I really don't know. I think that there is this rally around the flag effect in Israel, which is greater than it would be in a Western country. But I want to be clear, I do not think that Israeli public opinion will lead to the war ending or the loss of the war on the Israeli side. It's something that we need to grapple with, though, because Netanyahu is so unpopular. That said, my money is on the Israelis winning/concluding the war, either by getting the Americans to let them use their B-2s or by some other mechanism. But we need to keep in mind that the Iranians may be able to do more outrages and more retaliations that will be population-centric. And then who knows what that implication will be. But it does seem that, when we started the October 7th and I analyzed it, I said the Hamas has won the war already by the morning of October 7th. As soon as they broke in and got beyond the barrier and outwitted the Israeli intelligence and massacred civilians and babies and took women and children hostage, they won the war. There's no way to defeat Hamas. Israel can't win that war. Conversely here, because of the Israeli offensive and hitting the Iranian leadership and denuding Iran's ability to have anti-aircraft defense, I think the Israelis have won from the get-go. So I see those two conflicts as quite different. I see a Hamas victory, Israeli loss in Gaza, and an Israeli victory in Iran that will likely be brought to the conclusion, and that the home front will just have to suck it up and endure the pain. What are your thoughts, Jane?
It's very interesting. Israeli public opinion seemed to have turned against the war in Gaza, but that didn't make any difference to government policy, and it wasn't bringing Netanyahu's coalition down. Even if public opinion shifts, I wonder how that translates in terms of Netanyahu's political future. But I think in the coming days, if Netanyahu doesn't persuade the US to join the war, people will again start asking, what's the day after? Just as people have asked with Gaza, like, where does this end? And what's the exit strategy? There have been people arguing, for instance, in an op-ed I read yesterday in the Sunday Times, Israel needs Western help because Israel cannot defeat Iran alone. But that's going to prompt a debate in the G7 and elsewhere. Should Western countries help Israel because it's their partner? Or will they essentially say, if you couldn't do this by yourself, why did you start it?
Well, they started it because they felt existentially threatened and because there was a unique opportunity with the Iranian air defenses so weak after the last round, but the leadership not seeing it coming. You got to give it to Netanyahu and the potential good cop, bad cop diplomacy with Witkoff. I think, unfortunately, Netanyahu is a neo-populist who does things to stay in power. I'm able to have a lot of sympathy for the Israeli and Iranian peoples while having very little sympathy for their regimes. And I think that this is poorly covered in the media. I don't like how some aspect of the media is like, well, the Israelis get what's coming to them, so they have to go to their bomb shelters, or it's not a big deal. I'm sorry, that would not be the coverage if there were bombs falling on Birmingham. Do you know what I mean? It's just kind of insane. And then the idea that, well, the Ayatollahs, they didn't really plan to enrich for making a bomb. Well, that's absolute junk. We know that they didn't just have a civilian program.
We don't know that they didn't just have a civilian program. We know
I disagree with that.
It is believed that they had a clandestine weapons program in the early 2000s. It's known that they were enriching uranium above levels that you would need for civilian use. But there was also their political brinkmanship. They miscalculated a number of things, but they essentially thought that this was leverage. This was leverage they could use in future to...
Well, it can't be both leverage and they don't have a program. Either they have leverage trying to get the ability to have a breakout capacity, or they don't have leverage.
Well, they don't have a weapon. They have been enriched, or at least, according to best available Western intelligence assessments before a few days ago, they were not believed to have taken a decision to weaponize or to have taken that step, but they were enriching uranium above the levels they would need for a civilian program.
By far. The levels that they need for the civilian program is what the JCPOA allowed them. Mm-hmm. That's like 3.7%. They were getting to 60 and 90% to make weapons-grade uranium. I mean, I like to agree disagreeably once in a while. I think that it was demonstrated that they were going for a bomb or going to be able to have breakout capacity, right? And whether or not they were going to hold back from actually breaking out, that's how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's a theological debate, right? That was going on, and I don't think it's fair, as some Western outlets do, to let them hide behind that fig leaf. I think that there's been a lot of content in The Guardian in specific, which I've found, wait, this is like way too pro-Iranian regime and how this is being pointed out. And yes, there are things that I would criticize the Israeli leadership on, and I have been criticizing them since, episode 1 of this podcast for being neo-populist and corrupt and this and that, but not at the level of the criticisms that I think need to be leveled against the regime of the Ayatollahs in terms of the way that they've suppressed their own people in the Mahsa Amini protests and have been pursuing this bomb so as to be able to oppress both their populations and their neighbors, because they know once they get the bomb, they can never be turfed out of power, right? So this was the end game here. I don't think that the media and, in a way, Western diplomats have really grappled with the nub of the issue. There's no coverage of what the actual end game strategy is. What is the next steps? And just to wrap up, let's order the disorder, Jane. Lightning round. Do we both agree bombs are going to be falling for more than the next week?
Highly likely.
B, there's going to be civilian casualties on both sides, but the Israelis are mostly not going to be targeting civilians. They're going to be targeting regime figures or infrastructure, and the Iranians have now made it clear that they're just targeting mostly civilians.
I don't think it's in Israel's strategic interest to target civilians, but I think we're in a real fog of war situation. And I think while they may not be deliberately targeting Iranian civilians, Iranians in Tehran, whether they're civilian or anything to do with the regime, feel really unsafe. So I think I agree with you, but I think it is worth underlining that.
Oh, of course. I mean, the humanitarian situation in Iran is dire and people are dying, of course. Pain thresholds. Do you see the Israeli electorate or the Iranian people tiring with their leadership? I think that the Iranians will tire first, and the problem is that they may not have the levers to express that, whereas Israelis are not repressed and they can just have protests during the day if there are no bomb sirens.
Right now, I think there is rallying round the flag in both countries. I think the Iranians, for the most part, were pretty tired with their leaders. We might say the same in Israel as well. So it will depend partly on whether people on each side think that there is an alternative. They definitely will see that things could have been done differently in the past. Do they think that there is an off-ramp today? I think it's very important that the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi said yesterday, if Israel stops, we will stop. Of course, Araghchi was expecting to be in the home of the Omani foreign minister, passing messages to Steve Witkoff yesterday. So, he's also in shock. But it's a very different thing from the more standard rhetoric of we will keep fighting forever and we're completely undeterrable because we're so strong. I think that line from him is an important offer where some kind of mediation could start. But getting further, how you actually get Israel and Iran to stop the broader conflicts, that's an extremely hard challenge.
I think that there is a little bit of PR there in the Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister's line, because he knows that Israel won't stop if they haven't taken out the nuclear program. He must know that 70% of the enriched uranium, they still have it. Ergo, he'd love for it to stop now. And to play the, we're happy to make peace card when he knows that that's not going to happen. There's a media war here, and the Iranians are going to be playing that media war. I think that they're playing it quite well, as I said, in the kind of Guardian, we were just attacked, we didn't do anything to cause this bit. How that media war plays out is going to play out very differently in the US than in Europe. I think that in the States, nearly everyone from the AOC left through every part of the right supports Israel and feels that they are just defending themselves and that they have a just war doctrine here and that the casus belli was the IAEA report and everything that's happened to this point.
That's definitely a misinterpretation of the IAEA report. And I've certainly seen some Democrats saying, there were negotiations underway and these have, been blown up. Although that may also have to do with domestic politics around, do you support Obama's JCPOA or this new situation that we've got under Trump?
I think the Israeli actions, if you would poll the American electorate, is going to be 60 to 70% in favor. Yeah. And that's going to be in both political parties, you're going to have a majority.
And Iran is very toxic in the American political
And in Europe, you're going to get a different picture. In countries where there is stronger anti-Israel and more pro-Palestinian sentiment, like Ireland or Spain, you're going to see support for Iran and an opposition to Israel, not based on the merits of what targets were hit or not. I mean, I've been tracking by looking at different media. Literally, the more pro-Palestinian the media, the more that they say that they don't think that Israel had a right to attack these nuclear sites. In other words, it's not being evaluated strategically. It's being evaluated in this culture war phenomenon. And this is going to be my last point before we wrap up here. And I want to know your thoughts on this point. Part of the enduring disorder is that everything becomes connected to everything else, and it's fighting as a culture war rather than a strategic issue. Trump is just constantly dead catting. Oh, there's a military parade. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. Don't pay attention to the fact that there's like 1 million people at these No Kings protests and that ISIS is, using tear gas on civilian protesters in LA. No, I'm helping our ally in this war. Classical dead cat. I think that the dead catting makes it more likely that these conflicts spread and unite. And the spreading and the uniting of these conflicts is because the West can't get its act together. They're at the G7, but the British and French electorates have a very different position than the American electorate. The Italians are yet different, like in how they see Ukraine and what their threshold is to the rising gas prices relative to others. So we're not getting a unified Western approach, and hence it's difficult to make an off-ramp. I would love to see an off-ramp. Mine and yours might differ. I don't want an off-ramp until the enrichment capacities are now completely destroyed. I wouldn't have advocated this route. I love the JCPOA. I was Obama all the way. I was happy that Jake Sullivan was sleeping at my old house when I used to work at the embassy in Muscat. He was, camping out on a couch there, negotiating these things. All great.
I did not know
but
that.
When the JCPOA imploded, now we're in this situation. I wouldn't have launched this attack in this way, but now that we're at the attack, it's got to be done. That's my view. And you can only have an off-ramp when Fardao is completely destroyed. Do you see it differently?
I think we're in a really problematic situation, and I think I am a bit loath to say that something that I think was not right in the first place can now only work by being completed. I do think there was a very real chance of getting back a JCPOA-like deal, which would have enabled the verified removal from Iran of the highly enriched uranium, and that would have been a much better solution.
That makes it sound like you would have trusted the Iranians enough to point out where their uranium was and to have real inspections. I can't believe that was ever possible.
I would trust the IAEA to do a good job, and if it's the case that we can't possibly know enough about Iran's enrichment to do that, then the same argument would apply to the military route. If we don't know where it's hidden by any means and we have no way of tracing it, how would you then know that it's been destroyed?
No, I mean, you have to believe that the Israeli intelligence knows. They knew how to decapitate senior IRGC
and
commanders.
Why would they then,
I mean?
If they had that information about secret additional enrichment, they could then pass that on to Western allies and to the IAEA. And you would have international coordination to detect clandestine nuclear program. And you would have the ability of inspectors to enter. You could have the involvement of other states. I was interested in what role South Africa, which voluntarily dismantled its own nuclear weapons program, might be able to play in helping Iran to basically give up some of its capabilities in a way that was face-saving for them. I think that a lot of positive opportunities have been closed down by this war. And so in the middle of where we stand now, I don't have a very clear sense of what the best way out of this is. But I would hope that finding some way to avoid widening the war would be part of that. So I would worry then about the US getting directly involved, although I understand why you're making the argument.
I would have loved a world where the JCPOA was still intact and that we had rehabilitated Iran to be able to tap into its unbelievable human capital and deep civilization. That's the world that I'd like to live in. That we are now at this war. I fear that it needs to be done. I wouldn't want Netanyahu to have been the one in charge, and I wouldn't have want these political circumstances to have kicked it off. But I think it needs to get done, mega orderers. But either way, we're going to have a lot of disorder on our hands. So you're going to be hearing back from us quite quickly. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the man who you can trust to know where the uranium is buried, George McDonough. What shall we tell the listeners to do, Jane?
Dear listeners, you should definitely check out our show notes because we'll give you some tips for some really interesting stuff that you can read for a more nuanced understanding of all of these issues. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel, like it, share it with your friends. We're trying to build up these videos now, and we would love you to help us rave about them.
Yes. Rate and subscribe. I feel like enough people are listening, but we're not getting enough reviews. So if you're into this kind of content, rate, subscribe, share with your friends. And amidst all this mishigas and chaos, we wish you an orderly week. Hello, hello, mega orderers. We strive in partnership with the new production company Evergreen to create the best possible listening experience for you, the orderer. We appreciate your feedback about the show. We want to learn about you. What topics would you like? What kind of sponsors do you want to hear about? How we have a better experience? If you go to theshowsurvey.com/disorder, you can take a short anonymous survey and you will be entered in a drawing to win a $100 or £100 Amazon gift certificate. Again, that's theshowsurvey.com/disorder. Quick survey. It helps the show. And each week we will select a winner from participating. So you have a really high chance of winning. That's you, mega orderers. Go fill out the survey.